September 3rd, 1945. Yokohama. The air smells of salt and ash. The harbor is quiet now. No bombs. No sirens. Just a low hum of diesel engines and the crunch of boots on gravel. A young Marine from Iowa steps off the landing craft, his rifle slung across his back, his canteen half empty. He has been told the enemy is defeated, but no one told him what defeated looks like. A few meters away, a Japanese woman kneels in the rubble. Her kimono is torn. Her face is hollow. Beside her, a boy, maybe 5 years old. His eyes are too large for his face. He does not cry. He does not speak. He simply stares at the American soldier. Not with hate. Not with fear. With something worse. Emptiness. The Marine stops. He looks down at the ration bar in his pack. It is his last one. He was saving it for tonight. But tonight seems very far away now. He kneels. He extends his hand. And in that moment, everything changes. To understand this moment, you must go back 6 days. To August 28th, 1945. The day the first American occupation forces landed on Japanese soil. The war had ended. The emperor had spoken. His voice, thin and crackling over the radio, had told his people to endure the unendurable. For millions of Japanese civilians, this was not a metaphor. It was a prophecy. Japan in the summer of 1945 was a country on the edge of collapse. Not just militarily, psychologically, economically, spiritually. The firebombing of Tokyo in March had killed over 100,000 people in a single night. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had introduced a new kind of death. One that did not announce itself with the roar of engines. One that arrived as light, as heat, as silence. By the time the Marines arrived, Japan's cities were graveyards. Over 60% of Tokyo's urban area was burned. Yokohama was 58% destroyed. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, each reduced to skeletal frameworks of what they once were. And in these ruins lived the survivors. Not soldiers, not officials, mothers, children, the elderly, people who had been told for years that the Americans were demons, that they would rape, torture, and exterminate. The propaganda had been relentless. Posters showed American soldiers with fangs. Newsreels depicted barbaric executions. School children were trained to fight with sharpened bamboo spears. Women were given cyanide capsules. The message was clear. Death was preferable to capture. And yet, when the emperor surrendered, those same civilians were told to cooperate, to obey, to survive. It was a psychological whiplash that left millions in a state of paralyzed confusion. The enemy was now the occupier. The monster was now the authority. And no one knew what would happen next. The American military knew this. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, had studied the Japanese psyche. He understood that the occupation could not begin with force. It had to begin with control, discipline, and, where possible, restraint. His orders were clear. Treat civilians with fairness. Avoid unnecessary violence. Show strength, but not cruelty. But orders are one thing. Reality is another. When the first Marines landed at Atsugi Air Base on August 28th, they were tense. Many had fought at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa. They had seen their friends die in caves, on beaches, in the mud. They had been told that Japan would fight to the last man, woman, and child. And now, here they were, walking into the heart of the enemy's homeland, unsure if the surrender was real or a trap. The Japanese soldiers who met them were skeletal. Their uniforms hung loose. Their eyes were dull. They bowed. They obeyed. They did not resist. And the Marines, expecting a fight, found themselves standing in silence, staring at men who looked more like ghosts than warriors. But it was the civilians who shocked them most. In the days that followed, as American forces moved into Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities, they encountered thousands of Japanese families living in the ruins. Some hid in basements. Others stood in the streets, frozen, waiting for the inevitable. Children clung to their mothers. Old men bowed deeply, expecting execution. And then nothing happened. The Americans did not shoot. They did not burn. They did not rape. They set up checkpoints. They handed out instructions. They began clearing roads. And slowly, cautiously, the civilians emerged. The Marines were not saints. They were soldiers, young men, most of them, who had been hardened by years of war. But they were also human, and what they saw in those first days shook many of them to the core. Corporal James Donovan, 1st Marine Division, wrote in his diary, "We expected resistance. We got stares. Empty stares. Like they'd already died inside." Private Richard Harmon, 5th Marines, later recalled, "There were kids everywhere. Just sitting. Not playing. Not crying. Just sitting in the rubble. I'd never seen anything like it." The official U.S. policy was strict. Fraternization with civilians was discouraged. Sharing rations was against protocol. Those supplies were calculated for military personnel only. But the reality on the ground was impossible to ignore. Japan was starving. The rice supply had collapsed. Distribution networks were destroyed. The black market was the only economy that functioned, and most civilians had nothing to trade. By early September, American commanders began receiving reports of malnutrition among children. Some estimates suggested that over 30% of urban children were suffering from severe caloric deficiency. The Japanese government, still in shock and disarray, was unable to provide adequate relief. The responsibility, whether officially acknowledged or not, was falling on the occupiers. General MacArthur was not blind to this. On September 8th, he issued a directive allowing for limited humanitarian distributions, primarily through Japanese authorities. But it would take weeks for the system to organize. In the meantime, the starving did not wait. And so, in those early days, something unplanned began to happen. Something that was not in the manuals. Something that would later be sanitized in official reports, but remembered vividly by those who were there. Marines began sharing their rations. Not all of them. Not officially. But enough. A K ration here. A chocolate bar there. A canteen of water offered to a child too weak to stand. It started small. A private handing a biscuit to a boy who reminded him of his younger brother. A sergeant leaving a pack of cigarettes and a tin of beef for a family huddled in a burned-out storefront. The Japanese civilians did not understand at first. They thought it was a trick, a test. Some refused, bowing repeatedly, backing away in fear. Others took the food and ran, expecting punishment. But when no punishment came, word began to spread. The Americans give food. It was a whisper at first, then a murmur, then a fact. And with that fact came something that had been absent in Japan for months, perhaps years. Hope. Lieutenant Howard Kelly, stationed in Yokohama, wrote to his wife in Oregon, "You should see their faces when we hand them something. Anything. They look at us like we're angels. But we're not. We're just guys who have a little extra. And they have nothing." This was not policy. It was instinct. And it was about to create a moment that would be remembered for decades. Private First Class Daniel McCaffrey, 22 years old, from Des Moines, had survived Polilio. He had seen men torn apart by artillery. He had killed Japanese soldiers in close combat. He had nightmares about the caves, about the screams, about the faces of the enemy, young, determined, doomed. And now, standing on a street corner in Yokohama, he was looking at a different face. A girl, maybe 7, her hair matted, her dress little more than rags. She was holding the hand of an even smaller child, a toddler, and they were both staring at him. He had been walking back to his unit after a patrol. His pack was light. He had one ration bar left. He had planned to eat it before bed, but something stopped him. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the simple, unbearable fact that he had food, and they did not. He crouched down. He pulled out the bar, unwrapped it slowly. The little girl flinched. He held it out. She did not move. He set it on the ground between them, stepped back, nodded. The girl looked at her brother, then at McCaffrey, then at the bar. She picked it up, held it like it was made of glass, and then, quietly, she began to cry. McCaffrey did not know what to say. He did not speak Japanese. He did not know if she was crying from relief or fear or something else. So he just stood there. And then he walked away. But he did not forget. Angle 2. The child's perspective. Her name was Akiko. She did not know the Marine's name. She did not know where he came from. She only knew that he was one of them. The Americans. The ones who had dropped a fire from the sky. The ones her teachers said would kill her. But he did not kill her. He gave her food. She had not eaten in 2 days. Her mother had given her the last of the rice that morning. Her little brother, Hiroshi, had cried all night. Her father was gone. He had been a clerk in the Navy. He never came home after the surrender. Her mother did not speak anymore. She just sat by the window, staring at nothing. When Akiko saw the Marine, she wanted to run, but she was too tired. So she just stood there, holding Hiroshi's hand, waiting for whatever was going to happen. And then he knelt, and then he gave her the bar, and then he left. She did not understand. She took the bar back to her mother. She broke it into 3 pieces. They ate in silence, and for the first time in weeks, Akiko did not go to bed hungry. That night, she asked her mother a question. "Are the Americans good?" Her mother did not answer, but she did not say no. Angle 3. The mother's perspective. Reiko Tanaka was 34 years old. She had been a schoolteacher before the war. She had believed in the empire. She had taught her students to honor the emperor, to sacrifice for the nation, to fear the enemy. And now the enemy was here, and her daughter was eating food given by a man she had been taught to call a devil. Shame was a weight she carried every day. Shame that her husband had not returned. Shame that she could not feed her children. Shame that she had failed as a mother, as a wife, as a Japanese woman. The propaganda had told her that surrender meant disgrace. That occupation meant humiliation. And yet, when her daughter brought home that ration bar, all she felt was gratitude. It terrified her. This gratitude, because it meant everything she had been told was a lie. Or worse, that the truth was more complicated than anyone had prepared her for. She watched her children eat. She watched them sleep without crying for once. And in the darkness of their ruined home, she wept. Not from sadness, from confusion, from relief, from the realization that perhaps, just perhaps, they might survive this. To a Japanese civilian in 1945, accepting charity from a stranger, especially from a foreigner, especially from a conqueror, was an act of profound shame. Japanese culture had been built on concepts of honor, self-reliance, and hierarchy. To receive without the ability to repay was to lose face. To beg was to abandon dignity. And yet, dignity does not feed a starving child. Many parents refused the rations at first. They bowed deeply. They shook their heads. They backed away. Some even scolded their children for accepting. But hunger is louder than pride. And as the days went on, more and more families began to accept. Quietly, reluctantly, with bowed heads and trembling hands. The Americans did not understand this. To them, giving food to a hungry child was simple decency. They did not grasp the internal conflict it caused, the cultural shame, the psychological fracture. To the Marines, a child was a child. But to the Japanese, a child was also a symbol, a future citizen, a reflection of the family's honor. And to see that child dependent on the enemy was a kind of death. But it was also survival. And slowly, survival began to outweigh shame. Angle 5, Command Reaction. Not all officers approved. Captain William Thorne, commanding officer of a logistics unit, issued a memo on September 10th, reminding his men that rations were military property and that unauthorized distribution was a violation of supply protocol. He was not cruel. He was practical. The supplies were calculated. If too many were given away, American forces might run short. But Lieutenant Colonel Edward Grant, a battalion commander, saw it differently. He had toured the ruins of Yokohama. He had seen the children. He had read reports of malnutrition and disease. And he understood that occupation was not just about control. It was about perception. If the Americans were seen as cruel, as indifferent, the occupation would breed resentment, resistance, perhaps even insurgency. Grant quietly told his officers to use discretion. He did not order them to share, but he did not punish those who did. And that discretion became a policy of tolerance. Other commanders followed suit. By mid-September, informal feeding programs began to appear. Marines would set aside a portion of their rations. Officers would look the other way. Chaplains began organizing distributions through local churches. It was improvised, chaotic, but it worked. Angle 6, ripple effect. Word spread fast. A woman in one neighborhood told her sister in another. A child who received chocolate told his classmates. A shopkeeper who watched a Marine give food to a beggar told his customers. Within days, the narrative began to shift. The Americans were not demons. They were men. And some of them were kind. This was dangerous for the Japanese authorities. The government had spent years demonizing the West. Now, civilians were seeing a different reality. Some officials worried this would undermine respect for Japanese leadership. Others saw it as an opportunity, a way to rebuild trust and cooperation with the occupiers. But for the civilians, it was simpler. It was food. It was survival. And it was proof that the world had not ended. That humanity, somehow, had survived the war. September 12, 1945. Yokohama, near the waterfront. A crowd had gathered. Not large. Maybe 40 people. Mostly women and children. A few elderly men. They stood in a loose cluster near the ruins of a warehouse, watching as a marine supply truck unloaded crates. Corporal Samuel Ortiz was in charge of the detail. He was tired. His unit had been working since dawn, clearing debris, setting up checkpoints. The last thing he wanted was an audience. But the civilians were quiet. They did not approach. They just watched. One of his men, Private Lou Novak, noticed a boy standing at the edge of the group. Thin, maybe 8 years old. His shirt was too big. His feet were bare. Novak glanced at Ortiz. Ortiz shrugged. Novak walked over to the truck. He pulled out a ration box. He walked to the boy. The boy stared up at him. Novak held out the box. The boy did not take it. Novak set it on the ground. He stepped back. The boy looked at his mother. She was standing a few meters away. Her face pale, her hands clasped tightly. She nodded. Barely. Just a slight tilt of the head. The boy picked up the box. He bowed. Deep. Low. His forehead nearly touched his knees. And then he started to cry. Not loud sobs. Quiet, shaking breaths. The kind of crying that comes from deep exhaustion. From relief so overwhelming it becomes grief. His mother rushed forward. She knelt beside him. She held him. And she began to cry too. And then others joined. A woman in the crowd. Then another. An old man wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. A teenage girl covered her face. Within moments, the entire group was weeping. Silently. Collectively. As if all the fear and hunger and desperation of the past months had finally found a release. The Marines stood frozen. Novak looked at Ortiz. Ortiz looked at his men. No one had expected this. They had expected gratitude, maybe. Or indifference. But not this. Not tears. Not this raw, unfiltered emotion. One of the privates, a kid from Tennessee named Earl Brooks, whispered, "What do we do?" Ortiz did not answer. He did not know. So he did what felt right. He walked to the truck. He pulled out more rations. He motioned to his men. They understood. One by one, they began handing out boxes. To the women. To the children. To the elderly. No questions. No ceremony. Just simple, quiet distribution. And the civilians took them. With bowed heads. With trembling hands. With tears streaming down their faces. By the time the truck was empty, nearly 100 people had gathered. The Marines had given away half their supplies. Technically, this was a violation. Technically, they could be reprimanded. But no one reported it. And no one regretted it. That evening, word of the distribution reached Lieutenant Colonel Grant. He arrived at the site 2 hours later. The crowd had dispersed. The Marines were loading the empty truck. Ortiz stood at attention, expecting a reprimand. Grant looked at him, looked at the empty crates, looked at the exhausted faces of the men. "How many civilians?" Grant asked. "Maybe 100, sir," Ortiz replied. "Any incidents?" "No, sir." They were grateful. Grant nodded slowly. He turned to his adjutant, Captain Morris. "Get me a report on civilian food supplies in this district. I want numbers by tomorrow morning." Morris hesitated. "Sir, are we?" "We're doing what needs to be done," Grant said. "The war's over. We're not here to starve them. We're here to stabilize. And you can't stabilize a population on the brink of famine. He turned back to Ortiz. Good work, Corporal. Carry on. Ortiz saluted. Relief washed over him. But it was not the relief of avoiding punishment. It was the relief of knowing he had done the right thing. And that someone in command understood. That night, Grant sent a message to division headquarters. He requested authorization for organized civilian feeding programs. He cited the Yokohama distribution as evidence of need and feasibility. He argued that small acts of humanity would do more for occupation stability than any number of checkpoints or patrols. His request was approved within 48 hours. By September 20th, official feeding stations began to appear in Yokohama, Tokyo, and other major cities. They were run jointly by American forces and Japanese local authorities. Rations were distributed in an orderly fashion. Lines formed. Families waited. Children received milk powder and canned meat. It was not enough to end hunger, but it was enough to prevent mass starvation. And it was enough to change how the Japanese people saw their occupiers. The tears on September 12th were not an isolated incident. They were a turning point. A moment when fear gave way to trust. When propaganda crumbled in the face of reality. When ordinary soldiers and ordinary civilians found common ground in the simplest of acts, the sharing of food. It was not heroism. It was not strategy. It was humanity. And in the ruins of a defeated nation, humanity was revolutionary. The weeks that followed saw a rapid expansion of American humanitarian efforts. General MacArthur, recognizing the strategic value of goodwill, authorized the creation of the Civil Affairs Division, tasked with overseeing food distribution, medical care, and infrastructure repair. By October 1945, over 3.5 million Japanese civilians were receiving some form of American aid. The effect was immediate. Malnutrition rates among children began to stabilize. Disease outbreaks, which had been feared as a post-war epidemic, were contained. And most importantly, civilian resistance, which intelligence reports had predicted, never materialized. The Marines who had participated in those early distributions were rotated out over the following months. Many went home. Some stayed as part of the occupation force. But all of them carried the memory of those tears, of those bowed heads, of the moment when the enemy became human. Private Lou Novak returned to Wisconsin in December 1945. He rarely spoke about the war. But in 1962, during a school presentation for Veterans Day, he told the story of the boy in Yokohama. He told the students that war was not just about fighting. It was about what came after. And that sometimes, the most important battle was the one for trust. Corporal Samuel Ortiz stayed in Japan until 1946. He witnessed the transformation of the occupation, the reconstruction, the slow return to normalcy. And he remained convinced that the feeding programs had been the key. You can't build peace on an empty stomach, he later said in an interview with a military historian. You can try, but it won't last. For the Japanese civilians, the impact was even deeper. The shame of accepting American aid did not disappear overnight, but it was gradually replaced by something else, recognition. Recognition that the war was over, that survival was possible, and that the Americans, for all their power, were not monsters. Reiko Tanaka, the schoolteacher whose daughter had received that first ration bar, began volunteering at one of the feeding stations in October. She helped translate. She organized lines. She kept records. And slowly, she rebuilt her sense of purpose. In 1947, she was hired by the Allied Occupation Administration as a liaison officer. She worked with American officers to coordinate food deliveries to rural areas. She never forgot the day her daughter brought home that ration bar. And she never stopped being grateful. The images of American soldiers feeding Japanese children became iconic. Photographers documented the feeding stations. Newsreels showed smiling Marines handing out candy to kids. These images were used in propaganda on both sides. The American military promoted them as evidence of the occupation's success. The Japanese government used them to encourage cooperation. But for those who were there, the images were not propaganda. They were memory. Real. Raw. Unscripted. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of a surrender, A group of Japanese survivors organized a reunion in Yokohama. They invited American veterans. Over 200 people attended. Many had not seen each other since 1945. They shared stories. They cried. They laughed. And they honored the moment that had changed everything. One attendee, a woman named Haruko Yamada, stood before the crowd and said, in halting English, "When I was a child, I was very hungry. An American soldier gave me chocolate. I did not understand. I thought he would hurt me. But he smiled. And I knew it would be okay." She paused. Her voice broke. "Thank you. Thank you for saving us." The room fell silent. Then slowly, applause began. Not loud, not triumphant, quiet, respectful. A recognition of shared humanity in the aftermath of inhumanity. The ration sharing of September 1945 was never an official policy. It was never a planned operation. It was spontaneous, improvised, driven by instinct rather than orders. And yet, it may have done more to secure the peace than any treaty or occupation directive. Because in the end, people do not trust institutions. They trust experiences. They trust gestures. They trust the memory of a soldier kneeling in the dirt, offering food to a starving child, expecting nothing in return. That memory outlasted the occupation. It outlasted the treaties. It became part of the story both nations told themselves about the war. And it remains, to this day, a testament to the stubborn resilience of human decency in the face of unspeakable violence. War is a machine. It consumes lives, cities, futures. It turns neighbors into enemies and reduces morality to strategy. But war does not last forever. And when the guns fall silent, what remains is not victory or defeat. It is people, hungry, exhausted, afraid, trying to survive. The moment those Japanese civilians cried was not about politics. It was not about empires or ideologies. It was about a simple truth. Kindness, even in the smallest form, can break through the hardest walls. A ration bar, a canteen of water, a nod of acknowledgement. These were not grand gestures, but to those who received them, they were everything. History remembers the battles, the strategies, the leaders, but it often forgets the moments in between, the quiet acts, the uncelebrated decisions, the private who shares his last meal, the mother who lets her child accept help, the child who learns that the enemy is not always what he was told. These moments do not change the outcome of wars, but they change the outcome of peace. 79 years later, the feeding stations are gone. The Marines have gone home. The children who cried are now grandparents, great-grandparents, or dust. But the story remains, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can find a way to reassert itself, not through grand declarations or sweeping reforms, but through the simple, stubborn insistence that people matter, that children should not starve, that compassion is not weakness. The war ended on August 15, 1945, but the healing began in the rubble of Yokohama, in the hands of a Marine who gave his last ration to a child he would never see again. That is the moment that mattered. That is the moment that endures.